the PRC has become so opaque and so closed, it's quite difficult to know what top level people are saying. And this is actually a problem, including when it tries to be a peacemaker.
That make Russia aggressive, imperialistic, delusional with regard to its own position in the international order, and having these delusions of grandeur, as it were, in Putin, and issuing nuclear threats and so on. All those things are going to be problems in its relationship, in Russia's relationship with China.
They do want to have a Russia that is viable, and they want to be able to have a position where Ukraine accepts some sort of accommodation. So essentially, they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Global Eyes by DW.
China, the peacemaker. Well, China has recently brokered a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran. China has also offered to mediate between Israel and the Palestinians. And China has proposed a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. But China is also having some trouble with the G7.
Everywhere you look these days, it seems like China is trying to not just be a big power, but a great mediator in conflicts all around the world.
So the question that we are asking today is, can China be taken seriously? Can China really broker a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia? I'm Isha Bhatia-Sanan. I'm senior editor here at DW.
And I am William Glucroft, a security reporter here at DW. And Russia's war in Ukraine really is a major and serious case study of all of China's talk about being an honest broker.
And this is Global Eyes, where we take a new look on security policy. We break down those things for you so you understand how they affect your life directly.
And to help us break that down, we have two guests coming from very different parts of the world. First, we have Ian. He is an associate professor in international relations at the National University of Singapore.
And from London, we have Rohan Mukherjee. He is assistant professor at the London School of Economics.
Thanks so much to you both for joining us. Welcome to Global Eyes. Ian, let's get the first question over to you. Very broadly speaking, how serious is China about being a peacemaker, and is Ukraine the place where it shows its stuff?
I think more than anything else, China wants to be in a sort of position where it helps shape the global order. And so being a peacemaker, if it helps sort of support that kind of position, that's where China will go. I think with regard to the peace plan for Ukraine, that's China trying to figure out, right, how it can move in that direction to be a sort of provider of global order or global goods in a way that gets other states to trust it more, to accept it more. That's, I think, what lay behind its efforts to bring Saudi Arabia and Iran together, and also its proposal on Palestine and Israel.
Yeah, we're going to get to those points definitely. So let's stick with Ukraine for just a second. What do you make of these latest movements? We're finally seeing Xi Jinping and Volodymyr Zelenskyy on the phone. We're seeing this peace plan that was brought forward. What do you make of these, initial incremental steps of China kind of making its way into, this devastating war in Ukraine?
So like I said, I think the PRC is trying to feel its way around. It's trying to put itself in a more positive light. It previously, I think, got a lot of criticism for being too supportive of Russia, especially in the global north, and for places that sort of felt that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was completely egregious. Not everyone, of course, thinks that way. But anyways, the PRC has to sort of sell that message to Europe, has to sell that message, I guess, to North America and Northeast Asia. So the moves so far, I think, are quite tentative. In essence, China has any sort of peace in Ukraine, I think, has to deal with three issues. One is that the Europeans need to feel secured, and that means that there needs to be some sort of credible restraint on the part of Russia. Ukraine certainly wants that, but also wants its territory back. And Russia, under Putin, I think wants to have some ability to tell a story of victory, or at least having moved ahead, because Putin has staked so much of his own regime sort of credibility into the war, so he wants to be able to walk away with something. And so that is trying to solve those three simultaneous problem sets, I think, is what China and other actors actually will have to face. And so China's trying to figure out how to do that. It's been very tentative so far. The 12-point peace plan, or actually the 12-point position paper, I think just lays out some basic principles. It doesn't commit the PRC to anything. The sort of talks so far, they don't seem to have really made big promises. Ukraine, President Zelenskyy of Ukraine had made this ask with China to have the children who were taken away by Russia, Ukrainian children taken away from Russia to be returned. Now, there's no response as yet from the PRC side. There's no clarity on when or where that will happen. I guess that's something that on the Ukrainian side, they are laying out as a test of what the PRC can deliver.
Let's stick to the 12-point peace plan. Now, West has said that it's not viable. What exactly are the problems with the plan?
Well, I think, as Ian said, it's not a very sort of there's not a very substantive effort here by China to sort of offer any solutions. But I think there's a deeper problem here, which is, in a sense, it doesn't take into account the issue on both sides of the combat, as it were, right, of the war, which is that until a workable political solution comes forward from both participants, it's hard for an outside power like China, and frankly, even the West. I mean, the West has struggled as well to bring both sides to peace. So this is not something that is unique in a sense to the Chinese efforts. But I would say at the same time that I think China's efforts may be a little bit lacking in sort of substance because they've been mostly offering support to Russia, which is really in violation of international order, international norms, and so on. So I go back to sort of Ian's point that this is, or rather, I would develop that point a little bit further and say this is image management more than it is a substantive effort to sort of solve the conflict. I think China has picked up a lot of flack from various countries, both in the West, but also in the global South. And again, opinion is divided, of course, on the causes and the consequences of the war. But there is this effort to sort of roll things back and appear to be at least a peacemaker in that regard. I think there's also an additional factor here, which is the war is increasingly costly for countries around the world. I mean, the impact of the war on global supply chains, on commodity prices, on fuel and fertilizer prices. These are things that China feels as well as many countries in the global South do, and that has indirect effects on countries that are part of the BRI, that owe China money from loans that they have taken. So it affects the fiscal ability of many countries to actually function properly. And so this has wider economic ramifications, and China has a material interest in bringing the war to a speedy close.
Rohan, you were talking about the sort of credibility, the image management that China is trying to do here. Is that working, especially with China's neighbors in China's region? On one hand, you have China talking about territorial integrity, protecting the sovereignty of nations, how important that is, upholding the UN Charter. On the other hand, it has this so-called no-limits friendship with Russia, which it hasn't backed away from, and Russia has violated the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So where is that image management in the eyes of Asia and the neighbors and partners of China?
No, it's a great question. I think no country has a spotless image. Obviously, I think it's always you're sort of trying to balance the things you say and the gap between the things you say and the things you do. And so in that sense, I think it's very evident from people who are watching what China says and does that there's a substantial gap in that regard. And so image management is necessary, but may not be that effective. I mean, when you see it's rather inexplicable, since the beginning of COVID, how China has struck out in multiple directions with regards to its neighbors, as you mentioned. So, it sort of reignited the border issue with India. You had sort of increasing incursions into, the air defense identification zones of regional neighbors, Taiwan, Japan, and so on. Fishing vessels near the Senkaku Islands, the Hong Kong security law. They really just struck out in all these different directions, and it seems that there's a little bit of a rollback happening now. I think that there is an effort to mollify neighbors, but also to fix to course correct on the Ukraine war as well, and sort of signal that China is willing to not the no limits friendship language. I think has put it into a corner that it's trying to get out of.
Yeah, Rohan, I'm glad you brought up Taiwan and also incursions in the South China Sea and Hong Kong, these kinds of things. And I want to bring a question back to Ian. which is in the West, specifically in the United States. You listen to commentary, policymakers, they're really viewing China and any kind of resolution with the war in Ukraine as through the lens of Taiwan. You hear things, especially in the United States, that Russia has to lose, otherwise China will take the wrong lesson from this and think it can be more bold and more aggressive towards Taiwan. And therefore, that's why it's so imperative, not just for European security, but for Asian security from a U.S. perspective, that Russia decisively loses the war in Ukraine. Is that how things are viewed in China as well? Is the view of any kind of resolution to the war in Ukraine viewed through its policies with Taiwan and its interests, its security interests, its expansionist interests in its own region?
So I think from the PRC side, for one thing, I have to caveat what I'm saying. The PRC has become so opaque and so closed, it's quite difficult to know what top-level people are saying. And this is actually a problem, including when it tries to be a peacemaker. We know what a lot of the experts are saying, but whether that makes it to the top level is a big question. So that having been said, I think the PRC wants a Russia that is somewhat viable because that distracts the United States and its allies, clearly its European allies, from paying more attention, putting more pressure on the PRC itself. So there's I think that accounts for some of that willingness to keep Russia going. But I think Beijing also recognizes that, by supporting Russia and the way that Rohan had laid out very nicely how it's becoming very costly for the whole world, that diminishes some of the PRC standing. So the Beijing leadership seems to be trying to straddle these pretty difficult positions because it's got interests in sort of multiple areas and they don't necessarily square with each other very well. I do want to come back also to the Taiwan and the US bits that you had mentioned, and also Rohan too. So frankly, for China's neighbors, its position is very perplexing. It's perplexing because on the one hand, it's trying to be a peacemaker, but the signals it seems to be sending about accommodating Russia seems to suggest that, Ukraine has to accept some loss of territory, when the PRC itself, in its own territorial disputes, has these very expansive claims that it doesn't seem to want to roll back on. At the same time, and actually, this is a point that I think the Ukrainians had made to the Chinese, that they want their territory. So that, on the one hand, doesn't quite square. On the other, this whole point that Beijing sometimes echoes, and certainly the media outlets, propaganda outlets, if you will, tend to echo, is this Russian view of indivisible security, which in the sort of contemporary rendering essentially is very much equivalent to spheres of influence. So for regional states that have thrived on a more open global system, to sort of think in terms of spheres of influence and having more exclusive relationships, that's actually pretty frightening, right? Because that undermines the whole sort of model of success and prosperity and, in fact, stability that they've enjoyed for the past decades. So in that sense, Beijing's efforts to be a peacemaker has to sort of square these sorts of issues. As expansive claims on the South China Sea, it's frankly quite aggressive military posturing towards Taiwan. That's readable everywhere. So that pulls away from that peacemaker image. And for the U.S., which you had mentioned, I think the point, at least my reading of the situation is, there are, I think, many voices in the U.S. who see this point: if Russia succeeds in Ukraine, that sends a signal that aggression pays. That using military force, of course, that would set off a not just potentially more Chinese willingness to press its claims, including through the use of force, but potentially other actors as well. That could pave the way for a much more unsettling and unstable world. I don't think anybody quite wants that. So there's this sort of effort to pull China away, to sort of say, look, aggression doesn't pay. You don't want to do this kind of repeat what Russia's doing with in Ukraine with Taiwan or the South China Sea, or in fact the East China Sea. But how far that argument is going, I'm not no one is really, frankly, sure how Beijing is taking those sorts of arguments at this point.
Right. Rohan, that sounds like double standards from China. And as we just heard, it pulls away from the peacemaker image. So would that mean that India could benefit out of it? This mistrust in China, could India benefit from that? And we also saw that in the G7, Zelenskyy and Modi met, and Modi even said that we would do everything possible to make sure that the war comes to an end. How do you see that?
Yes, I think India, in a broader scheme of things, as a country that is sort of, in a way stuck between China and the West, I think does benefit a great deal. So long as China is the assertive actor in Asia and posing a threat to countries in its neighborhood, and also to US primacy and dominance in Asia and beyond, it becomes a very natural partner for many countries that are seeking to not only sort of counter the growing military power of China. India has nuclear weapons, it has a very large army and so on, but also to look for economic alternatives to China, because the zero COVID policy plus the unpredictability of the Chinese regime with regard to Chinese business itself has raised a lot of questions about supply chain resilience and so on, and India is capitalizing on a lot of that. Now, India's own position on the war in Ukraine is also complicated because India has a long-standing relationship with Russia that is both built on defense ties, but also old strategic ties and a certain sentimentality of history that is still there in India with regard to Russia. And so India has been reluctant to openly, at least officially, condemn Russia for its action, but at the same time has offered humanitarian aid and peacemaking abilities, or at least willingness to do something to bring the war to a close. At the same time, India has the same compulsions, which are largely economic. I mean, a lot was made of what Modi said at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit last September, I believe, in Samarkand, when he said this is not a time for war and so on. And the media, particularly in the West, sort of played it up as a rebuke to Putin. It was hardly a rebuke if you actually look at the way Modi sort of made those statements. If you watch the original video in Hindi and see his body language, it's very much, a kind of, please don't take this too far. We are only willing to tolerate to some extent, but we're really struggling here. He mentions it in the context of sort of food prices, for fertilizer prices, and global inflation and so on. So it's very much couched in economic terms, as opposed to, say, a rousing defense of the international order and principles such as territorial sovereignty and integrity and so on. So India has its own position in all of this, which makes it a particularly advantageous one at this point.
I'm glad, Rohan, you mentioned the SEO. I know Modi did say that Putin has to move on to the path of peace, but that actually came after a lot of criticism from the West that Modi was not criticizing Putin at all for the war. Now, China and Russia are very close. What about India? Does India really have a say in Russia?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think this is going to be a sort of test for Indian diplomacy, but there are certain factors I think that will help. And one is, I think, people make a lot of how dependent India is on Russian defense imports, but it's equally the case that India is by far Russia's largest buyer of defense exports, right? And so India accounts for 1/3 of Russian exports in defense in the last 10 years. If you're that much of a buyer, you do have some leverage, right? You can actually say things, you can actually have your interests looked after to some extent when there's another player involved. The other thing I think is the very things that make Russia aggressive, imperialistic, delusional with regard to its own position in the international order, and having these delusions of grandeur, as it were, in Putin, and issuing nuclear threats and so on. All those things are going to be problems in Russia's relationship with China. I mean, China is not going to find a fully compliant partner that is going to do everything it says. There's always going to be negotiation. Russia is not going to take instructions so easily from another major power, just as it bridled against US power, it will bridle against Chinese power. And that creates space for India to sort of manipulate and work its historical relationship with Russia to further its own interests.
And so we've talked about, how China and India might have some pull and leverage in Russia, but looking at the other way, with the Western sanctions on Russia, China and India are also benefiting, for example, from cheaper oil. I'm curious, and this is a question for, I think, both of you, to what extent does this war actually benefit China and India, possibly that they might not actually be in such a hurry to end this war because they're benefiting from Russia's isolation by, also not complying with, at least fully, with Western sanctions? Or is that too cynical of a view?
Ron, you want to take that first?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there are short-term benefits. I mean, in the sense that you can buy oil and other energy resources more cheaply, other commodities. But it also depends on the individual positions of these countries, right? If you're India and you've been depending on Russian defense imports for so long, you're not going to get much of it now going forward, right? Because they've mostly depleted their stocks. They also proved to be rather ineffective on the battlefield against a much smaller country, right? So you really have to be asking some hard questions about your own defense procurement at this point. And so it's not a great benefit. I mean, to the extent that, yes, cheaper energy is good, other than that, there's not much here that economically benefits India. I'll let Ian speak to the China point.
So actually, there are a couple of complications here. So one is I agree with Rohan, with everything that Rohan has just said. I'd add to that while there is cheaper energy, there's also more expensive food. So it sort of cuts both ways. And the other point, longer term, at least in the medium or longer term, India could find its position on the defense procurement a little bit more precarious, because what we're seeing is as Russia's access to components and chips from Europe, from North America diminishes, it's turning more to the PRC. And so more PRC equipment is coming in into Russian defense articles. So what that could mean if India continues to buy from Russia is that indirectly its own defense procurement, its own defense articles could be indirectly dependent on PRC supplies for microchips, electronics, and components. And I'm not sure that India quite wants to be in that kind of a position when it has to think of potential standoffs with the PRC, whether this is across the Himalayas or when it's looking out toward the Indian Ocean. So that's, I think, another wrinkle that New Delhi may want to consider. Now, on the Chinese side, I think they've benefited in some ways with energy imports. Certainly, the price of food also affects. I mean, this is structural, right? It's global, so it affects China as much as it affects India or anyone else. But I think where they've also benefited quite a bit is to sort of have a captive market in Russia, so to speak, and that idea that you have a Russia that is still powerful, but quite dependent on Beijing would potentially give Beijing quite a lot of leverage, not just in economics, but also in terms of how it wants to position itself globally as it tries to compete with the United States. So in this sense, Beijing certainly sees itself as having benefited somewhat from the war. But of course, as Rohan put it so nicely, Russia too sees itself as a major power. To the degree to which Russia is willing to accept a subordinate position over the long term, that's unclear. What we've seen actually historically is that the Russia and the Soviet Union guys in the PRC had an alliance, but the sort of fact that both saw themselves as major powers and were quite unwilling to be subservient to the other led to a split in that relationship. So this could come up again because, again, that's a structural factor.
Ian, I'd like to come back to the peace proposals that we were talking about in the beginning. Now, something that keeps on coming up again and again in most of these proposals, now I'm not only talking about Ukraine, Russia, but also about the other proposals, is abandoning the Cold War mentality. What does China exactly mean by that?
So that's a great question because no one quite knows. What it sounds like, right, is that the PRC wants to move away from confrontation. What it wants is a diminishing of the U.S. alliance system that was built up through the Cold War, because the PRC sees this alliance system as containing, in their words, encircling and suppressing the PRC. So certainly they want that to go away. Why I say it's unclear is because there are many aspects to the Cold War thinking. China, in many respects, is also a victor from the Cold War, right? It came out of the Cold War with opening reform, and its current prosperity and growth is a result of the decisions it made during the Cold War to break the alliance with the Soviet Union and then to align with the United States. Moreover, the PRC's sort of own the stability that we had in the late Cold War period came about through the sort of testing and of the various sites, such that there was a sort of understanding about where the red lines are. So in that sense, that benefits Beijing as well. So when Beijing throws out this, well, we don't want Cold War thinking, it seems that they are only thinking about the alliance bit that they don't like, but they, for whatever reason, do not talk about the other bits that they do benefit from as well. Because a end to the sort of Cold War, the sort of post-Cold War system can mean a lot more chaos. It can mean a lot more instability. I mean, Rohan works on order. He knows this much better than I do. That makes it more costly for states to interact and trade and do business with each other. And I'm not sure Beijing really wants to go down that route either.
Ian, you mentioned red lines, which I think is really interesting, because I think something that especially U.S. policymakers, even some of the best, China people, they can't quite figure out what China wants, where its red lines are. We're talking about the Cold War. One reason that we are definitely not in a Cold War situation is that in the Cold War, enemies talk to each other, right? The United States and the Soviet Union talked to each other. They had relations. There was some kind of level of exchange and respect there. And right now, between the U.S. and more broadly speaking, the West and China, that very little of that is there. So could you outline to the best of your ability, and you already said at the top, the PRC has become very opaque, but to the best of our ability, what does the PRC want? What is its red lines? In terms of its own security and its own interests?
So to take the Cold War analogy, or at least a part of it, right? I think that what you've described is the late Cold War period where there was communication. That wasn't the case in the late 40s or the early 50s. You're in Berlin. Think about the Berlin airlift, right? The sort of multiple Berlin crises, the erecting of the Berlin Wall. There was a lot of uncertainty, and there were a lot of proxy wars in the beginning of the Cold War because there was no communication, because there was no trust. And I mean, you see the Korean War, the Indo-Chinese wars, but how we got to a position where things settled down was multiple crises where the different sides learnt not just what the other side's red lines were, but what their own red lines were. And so why I'm making this point is when we look today, perhaps one parallel is we're at a stage where neither the US nor the PRC really know what their own and also what each other's red lines are. They will have to test each other out. You see things like the Cuban Missile Crisis there. We were very lucky. I mean, I really hope that we are as lucky again, but you never know. I mean, this is part of the problem with the lack of communication. It's very risky, and it's sometimes through hard, difficult, costly, and frankly bloody lessons that people learn. I'm really hoping we have become much wiser than during the 20th century, but I don't know.
Yeah, you say you never know. That expression is doing a lot of heavy lifting. We're talking about nuclear exchange. Definitely something not to take lightly. Another Cold War analogy, or lack thereof, is this idea of partnerships and allies. Throughout the Cold War, the United States spent a considerable amount of its own capital, of its cultural power projection, soft power projection, on building and maintaining alliances and partnerships. Yes, there were many, fractures to this day between Europe and the United States, but those partnerships are there, those alliances are there. Does China have the same thing when it looks at its backyard, its neighbors? Does it have, countries it can rely on?
So the PRC, quite interestingly, has sort of eschewed alliances since the breakdown of its alliance with the Soviet Union. So the only two countries where it sort of has alliances with, one is North Korea, the other is Pakistan. And it's perhaps not at the sort of formalized level that you see with the US. So that means to say that the PRC perhaps on one hand, it doesn't have as many allies to draw on as the United States. Perhaps Russia is one of them now, if their relationship holds. But not having that many allies to draw on, it also means that perhaps the PRC has a little bit more flexibility. It has a little bit more directions in which it can use its resources, because as you rightly point out, alliance management is costly business. It is difficult, and it can work, but you really have to work at it. You really have to put some effort into it. And if you look at the United States today, the way it approaches alliance is very different from what it did during the Cold War. Then it opened its market. It was willing to do a lot more trade. It was willing to underwrite a lot more security for its partners than perhaps maybe the case today. We see some variation in the U.S., especially during the Trump period. So the U.S. position maybe also be somewhat different from in the 20th century.
Rohan, we've heard a lot about the Cold War. Now, moving from the past to the future, hypothetically, if China does manage to broker a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, what would that really mean for US, for the US-based world order, and for the global South?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a big hypothetical. I think that if they were to bring about some sort of peace deal, I think it would really increase China's standing in the global South for sure, and in the broader sort of international order. I think many European countries would see that as a very big win brought about by China, and therefore I think it would certainly be positive. The US would, of course, certainly perceive a threat or to its own position in the international order, which so far has been that of the guarantor of the architect and then the maintainer, and now the guarantor of the international order. And the US has positioned itself as a country that is essentially defending the order against the depredations of countries like Russia and perhaps even China in the future if it were to actually act on Taiwan. And therefore, I think to do this would be to challenge that narrative and to show that the order actually can be sort of guaranteed by other powers, but it would also sort of reveal China's own preference with regard to the order, which is that fundamentally the current international order works for China. It has grown rich on the back of it. Joining the WTO was a great outcome for China. China has, nuclear weapons have stayed relatively limited because of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. China is a permanent member with a veto of the UN Security Council. There are many things to like about this current order. I think the main difference is that China would like to actually run things. They don't necessarily want to destroy what exists and rebuild with some other vision. They would like to just be the top dog in that order. And so bringing about peace in Ukraine and between Ukraine and Russia would be one way of sort of bolstering that status.
And how would India see that? Because India likes to be the big brother in the global South, at least.
Yeah, the competition between India and China in the global South, what used to be called the Third World in the Cold War, is many, it's long-standing, right? So in that sense, the past always echoes into the present and the future. And I think that India would certainly worry about its standing with the global. It's already, at least on financial grounds, China is way ahead of India in terms of, buying the support of global South countries. Now, if it were to also position itself as a political alternative to the United States or an order builder, a goods provider, all of those things, public goods provider, that is, India would have cause to worry, because then the amount of support that India would enjoy in a potential crisis with China, at least on a diplomatic level at a place like the United Nations, would be less than it is today, perhaps. Having said that, again, going back to history, when China invaded India in 1962, the non-aligned movement was quite silent. They didn't say much because this was seen as a conflict between two members of the non-aligned movement, as it were, or two at least sympathetic members of the non-aligned movement, and therefore there was not much to be said because the focus is always on the superpowers. And this is again a problem with this language of we don't want the Cold War mentality, because we're not in the Cold War, but now the alignments and the relationships are very fluid. There isn't necessarily these two big blocks.
I want to come back to you, Ian, for a second. We're talking a lot about, does China want to be a peacemaker? How would it be a peacemaker? Is it in its interests, and to what interest does it serve? I'm curious, very concretely, does China have the resources, the institutions, kind of the clout to even be able to do that? The United States, because it is the architect, as Rohan said, of the post-World War II, global security architecture, it has financial and geopolitical means to really be a peacemaker or a mediator if it wants. Does China have similar or parallel institutions that it could rely on?
So the PRC is very well resourced. It, at this point, probably can do quite a bit, but not on its own, because it also does have, it does face headwinds, right? So there are things that we know that China has a heavy debt burden domestically. It has a aging population, which means to say its economic growth will be slower. It has a maturing economy. So these things mean that maybe at this period we're looking at a time when PRC capabilities is really peaking. After that, it may plateau a little bit. So to underwrite in the way that Rohan had described, it is constant effort. You have to keep being able to engage in underwriting and supporting the system. So whether China has that ability to sustain its involvement, its guaranteeing of any peace, that's going to be quite key. And apart from the material stuff, I do want to add that another challenge that the PRC faces is the issue of commitment, because frankly, some of its recent behavior seems to suggest that it's more difficult to trust that the PRC will keep to its commitments. Why do I say this? If you look at Ukraine, there was a 2013 treaty. So this is not a declaration, it's not a statement. It's a treaty that was signed by both Ukraine and the PRC, where they basically not only articulated support for each other's sovereignty, but talked about discussions and joint countermeasures should the sovereignty of one party or the other get threatened. Well, what do we see? Beijing has not mentioned it. It's not even mentioned in the piece in the position paper. It's not been mentioned by Xi Jinping or Li Hui's in his visits. Right. So the question is, you make these promises. Well, how do you follow up on it? And it's not just the Ukraine one, right? The Ukraine treaty. You look at China's promise to Obama not to militarize the South China Sea Islands. Well, they evidently went back on that. In 2012, there was an agreement for the Philippines and the PRC to both withdraw from Scarborough Shoal. That happened, and the PRC came back. That was brokered by the U.S. So it seemed that the PRC went back on its word. The PRC is party to UNCLOS, but it didn't accept the whole arbitral tribunal process. It still thinks calls it illegitimate. If you look at the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the Basic Law with regard to Hong Kong, the PRC has moved away in spirit from that arrangement as well. So it has to work against all these apparent reneging, actions that seem to renege on promises it's made. Not to say that other actors, don't renege. It's just that there's a series of actions that, call PRC intentions into question more easily. And because they're also fresher in recent memory, to be a peacemaker, Beijing has to overcome these sorts of impressions and show that when it makes a promise, it will stick to it.
So maybe one sign of China being a true superpower or great power is that it does, have a lot of double standards like other great powers do have, as you point out. You mentioned about sovereignty. China really, really drives home hard this idea of territorial integrity and sovereignty when, as you point out, there's many double standards there. So from a Chinese perspective, what do they mean when they're talking about sovereignty and territorial integrity?
So they mean to say that they don't want to give up any of their claims. They make this. They have this sort of argument that's based on some sort of historical fact, which actually, frankly, is somewhat disputed. So it basically comes down to they don't want to give up on their claims. Now, that means that other states will be forced to. Vietnam, India. The point is that they would have to give up on their claims. It would mean that for Taiwan, the point is for them to accept whatever PRC dominance, control, or even annexation. So the sort of claim about territorial sovereignty is actually very uncompromising when it's on the PRC's side. However, when we look at what the PRC had been talking about with regard to Ukraine and suggesting that accommodation of Russia has to take place, they seem somewhat more open and more flexible when it comes to other states, having to compromise on their sovereignty and their territorial integrity.
Rohan, we just heard about Taiwan. Now, can China be a peacemaker and still continue its stand on Taiwan? And also after the G7, we saw that Xi Jinping said that there's a need of a new socialist Tibet. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's difficult. So I think going back to some of the themes that we've touched on so far, right? So this idea that what are China's red lines? They're tied to sovereignty. Like much of it depends on the ability to maintain Taiwan as part of China, the ability to control Tibet. Xinjiang, right? There's always been this sort of historical worry about the peripheries of China as being under attack from outside invaders, as it were. And so this anxiety of territory, of sovereignty manifests in a strong attachment to territory, right? So in that sense, you're absolutely right that it's very difficult for China to say, it's almost this cognitive dissonance is very, very strong, right? Which is to say that you uphold sovereignty as part of the international order, and that really has been China's position with regard to sovereignty in the United Nations Security Council, where it's been very traditional to say that there should be no outside interference in the sovereignty of countries, and at the same time to turn a blind eye when Russia does that in the case of Ukraine, but also then to also have all this talk about invading Taiwan and so on in the sort of Chinese public discourse. Although there is signs now that they are sort of clamping down on that. So it's certainly this hypocrisy certainly damages China's position, because many countries in the region worry about China doing the same thing to them with regard to their disputes. There are many disputes in the region with Japan, with the Southeast Asian countries, and so on. And of course, what goes on within China is a huge concern for the West. I mean, the Europeans worried a great deal about human rights violations in Xinjiang and Tibet. Well, building a socialist Tibet means essentially repressing Tibetans. And so there is a massive concern for countries that value human rights and democracy around the world.
I just want to add on to Rohan's point. I mean, the claim now, the PRC position now is that they don't give up on sovereignty, but historically that's actually been a lot more flexible. The 1950 Sino-Soviet treaty, for instance, they recognized independence of Mongolia, which is basically a repeat. That part was a repeat of 1945 Sino-Soviet treaty signed under the ROC. The PRC has given up its claims over territory that the Qing Empire used to occupy in Siberia. So if you go with the sort of historical claim, these historical reasons, there is some flexibility. It's just that currently Beijing is unwilling to demonstrate them.
So would you say this is more of a cover-up, that China doesn't want to be blamed later that China didn't try to bring about peace between Ukraine and Russia, or is that really a serious attempt?
So I think deflecting blame is part of it, but the other is China's effort to make itself an underwriter of a global system that it drives. So this also comes off the back of Xi Jinping talking about the Global Security Initiative and his Global Civilizational Initiative. So that idea of a civilizational China that helps define what the world is, that it shapes security around the world. So this idea of a peace plan and the other sort of peacemaking efforts that the PRC has engaged in recently, they fit into this idea of a PRC as, in Rohan's words, an architect, right, of global order.
But I'm curious, why would then China completely choose to ignore the 10-point peace plan that Zelenskyy had given earlier?
So there's where some of the PRC's interests, I think, they start conflicting. They, like I said, they do want to have a Russia that is viable, and they want to be able to have, a position where Ukraine accepts some sort of accommodation. So essentially, they want to have their cake and eat it too. At this point in time, of course, Ukraine rightly don't want to give up on their territory. So for the PRC, what they are trying to do is to set out this sort of image that they are managing peace, that move towards their sort of greater vision of the global civilizational stuff and global security stuff, without sort of compromising on the sort of specifics that Zelenskyy have laid out. And in fact, other proposals on the South China Sea, so on and so forth. So that's a bit of where the disconnect lies. I think they're trying to push for their vision, but insofar as that vision may diverge from the preferences of other actors, they may be willing to try to maybe not take those other preferences into account so much, or to sort of sideline them or sidestep them.
Do you foresee any scenario where this no limits friendship between China and Russia actually becomes a case where China would force or could force Russia into some kind of ending of the war and a peace agreement?
Ending of a war or peace agreement, I'm not sure, but I certainly know that one of the things that really concerns the PRC is a nuclear exchange, because I think they are concerned that there could be escalation that is very difficult to control. So you've seen the times when Beijing has quite gently but articulated a sort of difference in position with the Russians is when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons. So I think for Beijing, that's something that they're wary of, and that's probably also a consideration. They don't want Moscow to be in such a desperate position that it contemplates or actually uses nuclear weapons, because I think Beijing would find the sort of uncertainty that would result from the escalation quite unpalatable.
So I just wanted to add here that he said this earlier, a viable Russia is in the interest of China. And I think that cuts to the heart of the question, right? Which is, you don't want Russia to reach a point where it's really an existential threat for them, or they're on the verge of collapse, because it also sort of undermines a broader goal that China has repeatedly articulated, which is a preference for a multipolar global order, right? And what that really means is, a more distributed sense of power, but also more distributed control over what global order means to different constituencies in the order, right? So China wants the right and the ability to define what order is and what those norms are. It wants to control those institutions. And Russia is a very valuable partner and ally in doing all of those things because it is also a veto-holding member of the UN Security Council. And so if Russia were to collapse, that would be the worst outcome for China. So there's this delicate balance that's going on here, which is to say you support until the point there is a limiting factor here that if it gets too bad for Russia, you really want them to pull back from the brink and somehow bring this to a close before things get out of hand. And that's a really, really tricky exercise for Chinese diplomacy.
Right. So we've heard a lot about what China is doing, how China is doing it, why China is doing it. Now, to bring the show to the end now, we've also talked about hypothetical situations. For both of you, the question is for both of you. If not China, then who?
So ultimately, any peace will have to involve Russia and Ukraine deciding that they want some sort of political settlement, as Rohan put so clearly earlier. So the question is, how can other states sort of encourage Russia and Ukraine to reach that kind of position? So that means, on the one hand, both sides have some of this very unfortunate and bloody fighting will have to play out to some degree. That tends to be what happens in war, very unfortunately. And then perhaps this is where Europe, the United States, India, I think India can play a potentially very big role, might be able to step in, perhaps the UN. I mean, all the sort of peacemaking stuff, it only works if the belligerents themselves are willing to find some sort of settlement. And short of that, it doesn't matter with China or any other actor, it's really hard to bring things to a close. And actually, PRC efforts so far, why they've not been that successful is essentially because neither Russia nor Ukraine want to give up at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot depends on the war aims or the political objectives of the people who are of the states who are fighting, and until those come to some sort of agreement, or either side runs out of the will and ability to fight, right? That's another possible outcome, and we see that those, on the Russian side at least, there are big questions about its ability to continue this campaign to some extent. The West will continue to supply Ukraine as much as possible, but going back to recent memory, if you look at how things ended in Afghanistan or Iraq and so on, they were very unceremonious exits by large, great powers that were trying to essentially engage in regime change and were unable to do so. And so in the end, you get exhausted, your domestic opinion and public gets exhausted. They want to move on from the conflict. And that's one way in which, people can be brought to the table or just simply exit. The Soviets did that in Afghanistan in the 80s as well. So it's really difficult for an outside actor to decisively move the needle. So yeah, if not China, then who? I think the answer is always going to be the states that are fighting this war.
Right, and I think Rohan points this out quite clearly, right? Afghanistan, for the Soviets, it took a good 10 years. For the US, it took a good 20 years. They're still in Iraq. I mean, trying to do regime change, and it can be sustained for a while. It takes a while for the states in question to sort of figure out that they don't want to do this anymore. And the real tragedy, of course, is the destruction and the lives lost in the interim.
We don't know really what time it's going to take for the war in Ukraine to get over. Thank you, both of you, for your time and the wonderful insights. It was really lovely talking to you, and I think it really made us understand a lot of what's happening there, what China is doing, how it's doing it, why it's doing it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, a lot to unpack in a very interesting conversation about some high-stakes diplomacy that is unfolding in this moment and, the months and possible years to come. We want to thank our great guests. We had Chong Ian. He is an associate professor of international relations at the National University of Singapore.
And Rohan Mukherjee, who is assistant professor at the London School of Economics.
It was so interesting to hear, there's so many challenges here. And one of the maybe the biggest is that this idea of red lines. What does China even want? Maybe China doesn't even know what it wants. It's still finding that out. And that just makes everything so much more complicated on the global scale.
And coming to the question that we asked initially, whether China can be taken seriously, both our guests said that they can't trust China as of now. So we'll have to see in the next months what really happens. It's not just the US or the West, it's also India that's looking at China and not trusting China, and also trying to make sure that in this multipolar world, everyone has their share and every country wants to, of course, think about their own interests. So if you are watching us on YouTube, do let us know what are your thoughts. What do you think? Can China be taken seriously? Can China really broker a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia? This is Global Eyes, where we take a new look at security policy. I'm Isha Bhatia-San, signing off.
I'm William Glucroft. Thanks for joining us.
Goodbye.
Global Eyes, a new take on security policy by DW.